This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
I'm not trolling.
And I love it.
I'm just pointing out where they're wrong.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further. Specializing in commercial and industrial buildouts, floor coatings and coverings, high-speed concrete polish, floor cleaning, shot blasting, painting, energy efficiency, and pallet racking. With a proven track record of excellence, they have become the industry leader. To find out more, please check the link in the description. So, this is the first ever live edition of the Discord Talking Hardcore Book Club. Today we're going to talk about Tom Holland, who's a historian that Dan Carlin reads and talks to a lot. He's actually been on Dan's actually been on Tom Holland's podcast, The Rest is History, several times. Those are good episodes if you want to check them out. But Tom wrote a new book called Pax, which starts off with after Augustus. It's a book about the Roman Empire, but after Augustus, and through
The peace of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Pax Romana.
yeah, but up into from Augustus, the death of Augustus, basically to Hadrian. That's the name I was looking for. Okay, so it's a good book. I really enjoyed it. Scott, are you enjoying it? Did you enjoy it?
No, I really do enjoy it. I think Tom Holland does a great job narrating. Sometimes, just when you're driving or whatever, you gotta really. Sometimes you have to revisit chapters over and over again.
Oh yeah, I back it up because I got stuck in traffic and I was looking there. I'm like, wait a minute, which emperor just got murdered? Like I got to back it up. The part with the 4 emperors in 1 year.
Yeah, that got
on an audiobook is challenging, right? It's challenging because like keeping track of the names of who he's talking about. It's easier when you're reading it, I think. But okay.
There are major players who, make a lot of continuity through there. You see Titus a lot. Hadrian is a major character.
Mhm.
Let me just first of all say this is not some dry history of the Roman Empire. Right. It is. Tom Holland is an excellent storyteller.
That's exactly right.
and it's super in depth. I mean,
it doesn't read like a history book. Like I majored in history in college, and those books were boring. If we had read Tom Holland's books, I would have liked it so much better.
Everybody would have liked it so much better.
Yes, 100%. It doesn't read like a textbook. It's a story, and when you listen to him tell it, it really sounds like a hardcore history book with an English accent.
It does.
It's just like
it does. I think it's an excellent narrative. It's amazing that we know so much about these people's lives
from 2,000 years ago.
Consider all the research that. Yeah, consider all the research that went into providing this amount of detail, and it could very well have been some sort of dry encyclopedic narrative, but he does tell a story, and he makes you feel like you're watching these people's lives in motion.
Oh, yeah. And then, okay, so my biggest takeaway, let's jump into this. I'm going to start the ball rolling. My biggest takeaway is how effed up the culture was with the eunuchs.
Yeah.
And
I had that very top of my mind as well. Imagine the president of the and we're talking about Nero here, who is obviously a standout of the successors of Augustus, if they can be called such.
Yeah.
And just a quick recap. Nero was, well, he became emperor of the Roman Empire, and all he wanted to do was be an artist and sing and make music and
be a celebrity. Basically, sounds like more than an artist.
Be a celebrity,
chariot races, and all that stuff. Right?
Yeah, a performer, right? And just a very odd fellow, disinterested in ruling, had a wife, and the story I'm familiar with, I believe it's told a little bit differently in Pax, but that he was performing on stage and he came back and then he was like, "Hey, honey, what did you think of that?" And she said, "Oh, the audience probably didn't even notice you dropped that line." And he was like, "What?" And then he kicked her to death. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Like on the spot. Yeah, I think it might have been told a little bit differently in PAX, but
in PAX, what he said was,
wife,
I'm sorry, I was filling the blanks there. In PAX, what he said was,
yeah, go ahead.
that may have happened. There's some
Right.
rumors that it happened that way, or the others were that
Yeah.
she died in childbirth, or she went into premature
Yeah.
labor because he kicked her, and she was pregnant,
Right.
and so the baby and her died. And what was her name? I can't remember her name, but
I can't remember her name either, which is unfortunate because she's a poor victim of this horrible monster.
Mhm.
But just the point right there is that Holland is more careful with his storytelling than just to say,
yes,
here's the most crazy rumor, and I'm going to present that as fact. So we do have some objectivity there.
yes,
And just to continue, so now Nero's wife is dead. He's insane, right? And so he wants someone to replace her. And who does he find? He has his agent scour the empire or whatever.
So she was a famous beauty, right? Famous beauty. Everybody loved her. He took her from somebody else, I think it was. That like she was married to somebody else, and he kind of seduced her and wooed her. Isn't that? Am I remembering that correctly?
There was a lot of divorcing going on in ancient Rome.
So he can't find a woman that looks just like her. So he finds a young boy, chops off his junk, has this
sex change surgery.
Well, it's not really that.
Sort of.
Kind of. It's more just a castration, but chops off his junk, has him dressed up like his dead wife, starts calling this dude the same name as his dead wife, and
parading this person around in public, taking him to parties. Imagine being this person having to be introduced as not only what has happened to you and I am now this person's lover, but also I am this person who is dead, who is the wife of this person. That is insane victimization. And just imagine the president of the United States doing that to someone nowadays. Okay.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, how did the average person react to this? I mean, let's go all the way down the line. There's a lot of atrocities committed by Roman emperors that would be considered normal for the time.
Right.
But was this act even gross and insane to them? And I'm sure it was, because Nero was just a remarkable wacko.
I don't know. Remember, and Tom talks about how it seems like they kind of seen it as, holy shit, look at, he
has so much power.
He has so much power that he can turn a dude into a chick and into his dead wife.
All right.
Remember, it was almost seen as like a mystical thing.
Well, there was more.
Yeah, you're right. He did present it that way. He did present it that way.
And some people might have saw it that way. I'm sure a lot of people were like, holy shit.
Yeah, but also this person was trained in like the depravities of sexual like acts. Like,
amazing.
It's just so effed up.
And let's just back up for a minute here, because what PAX is about to me is about the legacy of Augustus Caesar.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
In both the positive and the negative, and Holland talks about this in there. There's one point that really stands out to me, and amidst all the civil wars, and maybe we'll get into that, was the point where the people cried out, will there ever be as good of an administrator as Augustus ever again? Right? And they were worried because of, I mean, think of all the civil war it took to make Augustus Caesar, not even the ones that he participated in personally, right? Because he fought Antony, he fought Lepidus, eventually they formed a new triumvirate, and then he, and okay, let's just back up from that for a minute. So Caesar starts a civil war to maintain his power against Pompey. He wins, becomes basically an emperor. He's about to go off on some expedition to avenge Crassus against the Parthians. He's going to go settle some stuff in Gaul. He knows that he's becoming too big for his britches in Rome. People don't like him there. And he's like, I'm going to give you a break. I promise. Just let me get this stuff settled. I'm going to leave. And then they stab him to death in Pompey's theater, which was acting as a senatorial form. Okay. Now Augustus, his grandnephew, it becomes his heir, right? And is just turns out to be a genius for politics and administration. Handles everything and well, war. Right? You know what I mean? Ends up Right. Yeah, and war, and ends up a second civil war, which is actually the third if you count the guy who came right before Caesar. But then another period of civil war with Romans fighting Romans. And I just want to take a moment here because we look back at ancient battles and like very, very, very far in the past, like Troy and all these people, and we think of tens of thousands of numbers, and then in the medieval period, it's not so many numbers. It was difficult to muster that many troops and all this kind of stuff. But the battles of the Roman civil wars during that era were tens and tens of thousands of people against each other. It's because they could summon that many people. 120,000 men fighting each other on the same field. And these were Romans. They knew how to kill. And those battles must have been incredibly brutal and bloody. And there's a point in Pax where Holland cites an incident where it is during this period of civil warfare when a legionary kills another legionary, stoops over his body, and realizes he has killed his own father. I mean, that is just that trickles down into the actual public, and it's just people did not want that anymore, and they cried out, "Will there ever be another Augustus?" Now, what happened after Augustus? There was Tiberius, because Augustus's family was manipulated and poisoned. You know what I mean? And his line actually died out very quickly. And then you had Tiberius, which was the son of his wife, gained power. Tiberius was a soldier, and then he had his own way of ruling and ended up being a weirdo on an island for a while, letting the Roman Empire, which it was now, govern itself. And then he kind of wanted Germanicus as this successor, but then that guy died. He was a little too popular. Something happened. It's presented in different ways. Caligula becomes emperor, and now the insanity really starts. And then you have Nero. This is the immediate legacy of the greatest, probably the greatest politician Rome ever saw. You know what I mean? And it's after that it becomes very much generals vying for power, the power struggle in the aftermath of not a clear succession, and just like your most recent episode, guys, with the aftermath of the death of Alexander. And it is also an age when, instead of simply being loyal to the Senate and the people of Rome, the legions were loyal to a particular commander.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to bring up. Do you think it's ironic that Tom Holland calls it Pax, as in the Roman peace, Pax Romana?
I don't think so at all. I think it has a double meaning, and I think it's very important to mention, to bring that up.
There was a whole bunch of bloodshed during the Pax Romana, though. That's why I'm trying to say, like, I mean, even in internal conflicts, civil wars, power struggles. I just, while we're discussing this,
but I think sorry, go ahead.
The premise is peace within the empire, but still, there's a whole lot of bloodshed that happens.
Yeah, I mean, most of what he's talking about is war. Yeah. During this book, that's about the peaceful time.
It really is.
Yeah. That's why.
That's human history, right?
True.
I mean, you look at this Pax Americana. I mean, there's been wars all over the world still, right?
Sure.
So people called it that.
Let's talk about.
Anyway, go ahead.
Let's talk about that word Pax. Let's talk about that word Pax and the different. And the difference of the meaning of words in ancient and modern times. Take the word freedom in the modern context. Maybe as an American citizen, maybe in a citizen of whatever country you're in, freedom has a particular meaning to you, and you may take a lot of what that means for granted, or maybe you've served in your country's military to protect that freedom in a very real sense, as we're seeing overseas. But there are different kinds of breaking down the word freedom nowadays. You have, personal freedom, political freedom, that kind of thing. A couple thousand years ago, freedom meant something totally different, and it meant something different in what part of the world you were in. Take Mesopotamia. There were certain parts of the world that did not have a word for freedom. They just didn't have it in their lexicon. Or the word freedom meant that you were granted a reprieve from your taxes for a year because you'd done some favor for the king. In Greece, freedom, meant a lot of different things, but it also meant the right to take slaves. And it was very gender oriented in that regard, and that if you were free, you were probably also a man. Okay. So that's just the word freedom, the words freedom and peace. We say these all the time. Peace, Pax. In this context, that has two meanings. One, peace inside the empire, just like you were saying, Scott. What did that require? A heck of a lot of bloodshed. Whose blood was it? Romans and the tribes of the Gauls and everyone on their borders. Like, there was a lot of killing done outside to establish that peace. Now, Dan says this all the time. There's that famous quote, the Romans create a wasteland and call it peace. If you're on the outside of the empire, the word pax meant something to you. And if you were inside the empire, that word meant something completely different to you. And they might both have been terrifying at certain points of time.
Right. No, yeah, I think you're right there. It's hard to put yourself into the mind frame of these people 2,000 years ago, when everything that is our culture is all based on not only their experience, but the evolution from those experiences for 2,000 years. Right. So
yeah,
there's so much built in things that we just take for granted in our understanding that wouldn't be included then.
Yep. What? Yeah, I was going to say something completely different, though.
Go ahead.
And it pertains to Pax. So what really interested me was the creation of the Praetorian. So, like, it basically became the emperor's, like, frat house. Or, like, guys that had his back no matter what. And as long as he kept bribing them, paying them more.
Yeah, they were his bodyguards. They were the Secret Service.
100%. Well,
yeah, they were the Secret Service, except much less regulated, and much less regimented, and much more Roman.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
But they'd also fundamentally.
And what is that? What is that?
Go ahead, Matt.
And again, we're seeing the direct connection between personal loyalty as opposed to loyalty to the state, right?
Yep.
The legions, before Julius Caesar, the legions were loyal to the Republic. After that, people needed their own personal troops.
Well, it was
right.
That started before that. It started with Marius. You know, when
he became a dictator.
When Marius, you know, he said, we can't just have it all be property owners.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he reformed the military.
He reformed the military, and then it started. Ever since then, they started to have the generals would get them their payment, and if the generals did well, they made more money, and so it started to be the generals, not Rome, that was
commanding the loyalties of the troops.
Right.
Yeah.
And Dan talks about that a lot in Death Throes.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing. So when you read Pax, again, the thing that stands out the most is, you're right. It's bloody as hell. You know, there are so many. Okay, well, this guy thinks he should be emperor, and that guy thinks he should be emperor. So they're going to fight with Roman soldiers.
And that's the problem. Augustus legitimately did possess the power to, well, I'm not going to say reestablish the Republic, but to maintain it, when in fact what he gave the people was the picture of a Senate and you know, but without any real power to it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, he knew what he was doing. He said, you guys could go ahead and vote on whatever you want, but you know who's in charge.
Right.
And so you could hold him personally responsible for all the power struggles that followed.
No, because they were having power struggles before him. I mean, it goes back to Marius and Sulla, right? I mean, and before
it does.
that,
Sulla, right?
You go back to the Gracchus brothers, right? That's what Dan started Death Throes with, because that's to him when it started to really.
Even before that, when the consorts were debating on who's going to go to war one day and who's.
Yeah, but
I mean, there's still a power struggle there.
Well, yeah, power struggles are eternal, but what you had was you had all these ambitions and egos struggling to be the top dog. And Marius and Sulla were fighting over that, and Roman soldiers died because of it, against each other. Right. That's what I'm saying.
You can go back to Cannae.
Well, no, that wasn't
Roman. Or Cannae?
No, that wasn't Roman soldiers fighting each other.
No, I know, but I'm just saying they one consort wanted the glory and then decided to attack.
Yeah, but this is different. I'm talking about.
It's still similar.
Roman soldiers fighting each other.
No, I understand what you mean.
In a civil war, right? And the civil war started before Caesar.
I think you're both right. I think Scott raises a good point in that the Roman martial culture was about glory and victory and ambition, political ambition. And in the Battle of Cannae, one guy wanted that power in the moment of being the victor. That was very much bred into them by their society. But what we're talking about here more is the struggle for that one seat of power that became an emperor, after after Caesar and Augustus was truly the first emperor in all but name.
Yeah, they were fighting over that who's the greatest, but they weren't saying that because it was like, oh, I got to stop him from being a king. Well, no, I got to stop him from being a king, right? And really it was like, well, none of them can be better than me, right? And Tom talks about that a lot in PAX, right? He talks about the ambition that is just drives Roman culture and how one of the genius of Augustus was to leave the Senate and let them have their ambition still, let them have their honor without really having the power. But it's amazing to me how long that culture of extreme ambition, once it was created, took to die out.
Well, what? I mean, it would take a long time to die out because if everybody's trying to one-up one another, I mean, you're going to have a...
But I mean, we're talking hundreds of years.
Sure.
Yeah, literally hundreds of years.
I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years.
You're going to have...
It became just a...
Go ahead, Matt.
It became just another kingdom, empire. It lost what made it special.
Well, not just another, though, because it was like massive. And...
yeah, a very powerful one, but at its core, the power struggle and the jealousy and the greed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The Republic was a unique thing somewhat at the time, right? And it's funny because when you listen to Tom, I just started Rubicon, and he goes back a little bit further in depth into the Republic than he does in PAX. Mm-hmm. And you really do see a lot of the similarities with the way we set up our structure here in America.
I was absolutely going to talk about that. I was kind of thinking of closing it out with that, but we just touched upon it. And
please elaborate, Matt.
Here it is. Mm-hmm. Here it is. Why are we so fascinated with Rome? Why do we continually, and I think it is because here in America, a lot of our government was kind of based on, on the precepts of that kind of thing, and which was emulated around the world. I think it's because, in a way, it's because we saw an example of ourselves, and we saw what could go right and what could go wrong, and we're always comparing ourselves. Like, this is how the Roman Empire fell. It's a lesson. When Gibbon was writing Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he was writing that contemporaneously with the formation of America.
Right.
And he was writing that as a he's writing that as a warning.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, here's what happened, and if you're basing your system on this, you better pay attention to how these people messed it up.
Right. No, I think that's accurate. But why are we always so focused on it? I think the real answer is because it was so well documented. Right? Like, what other empire in ancient history do we have this good a documentation about?
It's a lot. There's a lot there, and a book like PAX really illuminates that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's like watching a TV show reading this book. I mean, he not only illustrates
like watching a soap opera.
He not only illustrates from known facts, but he intuits here and there.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell when he's like, "This is my intuition of what people would think or act or speak or feel," and it just makes it so alive.
Yeah,
it makes it so alive, and it is. You're right. It is very well documented.
But I mean, we still talk about Cicero, and all these guys, right? Cato. Well, that's because they wrote that shit down, and it still survives now. There might be really good analogies in Chinese culture.
There is.
but we don't have it.
Sun Tzu, The Art of War.
Well, no, but I'm saying like not just that, right? But I'm saying like there might have been some Chinese empire that is as fascinating as Rome, but we don't have access to it, or at least our culture didn't when they were forming the country, and they didn't have access to it. I mean, we barely have access to that stuff now, if we do.
Well, I mean, comparatively, you can also say like the Japanese structure.
Right.
I mean, when you had samurai, and then you had shoguns,
Mm-hmm.
and then it all joined into basically one country after that. But I mean, we can look at their system. There's tons of writing on the Japanese systems throughout the past.
But the reason that hasn't fascinated Western culture for thousands of years is because they didn't have it until just recently. Whereas in the West, we've been studying Roman Empire since it collapsed or before.
And well, yeah, let's remember that as a republic, Rome conquered a large portion of the world, right? So it's like, how could these people be so democratic and
that
have a system of government that we might aspire to achieve, and yet be so strong and powerful and influential,
conquering, right? That's the difference here. Is there was a time and a place in a culture where freedom was great, but if you allowed yourself to be conquered, then you deserved it, right? Slaves, the way they thought of slavery was, if you were willing to not die and be a slave, then you deserve to be a slave, right?
Well, better than
Holland, the psychology of slavery is right. The psychology of slavery is always fascinated with me. Both the slaver and the person under that system of control, and Holland brings something up in PAX absolutely about that, where they had kind of an odd idea about slavery as compared to the people around them, in that you could be freed, 1. 2, as a freed slave, you could rise in rank through society. 3, you could achieve political office as a freed slave. You know what I mean? So that is astounding to some people. This says a lot about what you're just talking about how they thought about taking people into slavery, first of all, but their value of life at all. And I believe in Greece, contemporaneously with this, like, once you were a slave, that was it. That's all you were ever going to be for the rest of your life. You know what I mean?
Not entirely. The Spartans were, yes, everybody started off as a slave, but you could work your way into the military. I mean, you could become a Spartan and not.
I think the Spartans. When I say Greece, I mean more Athens and stuff like that. The Spartan is very much fringe.
Yeah, very much. But I thought something that so he kind of talks about the slavery issue both ways in this book, right? Because he does say what you said. I remember reading that, but he also talked about how the slaves that were the concubines.
Yeah,
that were the basically rapees, like they would never be able to rise up because culturally they had been used, and so they would, if they didn't die instead of being used, then they didn't deserve to be free.
And that also goes back to Matt's previous point on whether you're a man or a woman in the ancient world. Different. You were treated differently. Yeah.
Well, still now. I mean, men and women are different.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, you could have a freed slave as a male, but if you had a concubine, there's no way she was going to be a.
But sometimes the concubines were dudes.
That's true.
And that was something I never thought about, that they would call it a concubine until you're getting near the end of the book, and he's talking about Hadrian, and the guy who died in the Nile was his concubine. He was there with his
wife.
And he was like, he goes and tells a story about how, like, so it made it sound like this dude was really young, because he's like talking about
pretty young,
like how he starts giving acting scholarships to the boys that are coming of age and stuff in honor of this dude. And it made it sound like basically this was a prepubescent dude that was just hitting puberty. And then they went out and
also
were murdering lions together and then fucking. And that's just messed up.
And also, if you are not only a man and a military officer, and at that point a very powerful one, who rose to what Hadrian became, openly proclaiming your love for another man, not a big deal. Not a big deal at all.
Well, and it's not that he's a dude that I find weird. I think it was, I just got the impression that he was young, and that just freaks me out. Yeah. And that was ancient times. It was it was everywhere. And so I just listened to The Rest is History. They did a series, and this is also Tom Holland's podcast. They did a series about Baghdad, and there's a whole lot in there about eunuchs and the castrating. And I knew that there was a culture of castrating dudes, but it didn't occur to me that it was so that they could fuck them. Pardon my French.
Not only that,
but watch over the harem.
No, but I don't get the feeling that that's really what it was. I think
that was some of it.
I think most of it was actually just so they were banging the castrated dudes, and then
there's three things there. One, yes, I want you to be more like a woman, in the case of Nero. Two, Scott, you're absolutely right, so you can guard the women with no threat of sexual violation. And three, some men were castrated so they could have better singing voices.
Right. And then they also, castrated later on anyway, they castrated the slaves they brought over from Africa, so they couldn't reproduce and have numbers on them. But
again, the dichotomy, we're looking at a system of government that we emulated when we founded this country, and has all these horrible things in it. And let's just pick slavery out of that. Now, the founding fathers, there's this big thing, the Constitution, all men are created equal.
Right.
They owned slaves. Right. You know what I mean? That was in the Roman culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we can see the direct lineage of this dichotomy of thinking where we are going to have freedom.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to, and freedom means something different, yet we are going to have this lower caste of people and treat them horribly. And we're going to say everything's okay.
Right.
But, later generations will judge us more harshly.
But even the founding fathers knew that they needed to get rid of slavery. They just didn't know how to at the time.
They couldn't at the time. They wouldn't have been able to keep the United States united.
Correct.
But
look at what it took to get rid of it.
So you got one of the things that I've thought about this a lot, right? Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. It took a massive civil war. One of the things that I've thought about a lot, though, is like you got Patrick Henry with that famous speech, give me liberty or give me death. And if you listen to that speech, so Mike Rowe did a podcast. He does the podcast called The Way I Heard It. And a couple years ago on the 4th of July, he released a rendition of that speech that he does himself. And man, you listen to that and it gives you freaking chills. All right. You're just like, holy crap, I want to go shoot some British people. Right. And then you think about it, because Patrick Henry owned slaves. And you're under, okay, that's why he knew how shitty it was to not be free.
Yep.
And he could do that to people because humans are hypocrites, right? They're hypocrites. But he knew how crappy it was to be a slave because he saw it every day. And that's why he was willing to fight to not be a slave himself. And it's interesting.
We're pretty far removed from...
This is what we do. This is what we do, Matt.
And it hasn't even got weird.
Okay. Yeah. Back to PAX.
No. But
we got to get to Jerusalem.
Just really quick, I wasn't saying we're far removed from the subject matter. I'm saying we're far removed from people in our society having those kinds of experiences anymore, aren't we? That's what I was going to say. But yeah, the Siege of Jerusalem by Titus was extraordinary. So PAX is an overview.
One second. Jack just made a good point about the eunuchs in the chat. So he said, you also ensure that the father of your heirs is you if you control all the dick in your vicinity. Great point. chopping off all the people around the women, make sure that you're the one your blood's the one that continues. That is also true.
It's like, yeah,
there's one thing that I want to throw into that, George. It's not like, Roman women would also have gladiators, satisfy them.
Sometimes.
Male gladiators.
Yeah, sometimes.
So you don't know if that's,
whose
kid that actually is.
How could you ever really know?
There was no DNA test back then.
Right.
So if all of a sudden it looks like,
unless you don't let her leave the house.
Nah.
I mean, they were thoroughbreds, They were, they were property.
Yeah, man. And I think he talked about that in PAX too a little bit, right? About how some of the empresses were infatuated with the gladiators and stuff. Sure. Yeah.
I think a lot of high-ranking women were. Why wouldn't you be?
Jerusalem is important in this story because PAX is not an action-packed book full of battles. It is very much about the continuity of politics, and there are high points of action in it, and Jerusalem is certainly one of them. He gets into it a little bit about the siege and some of his quotes that he's describing the soldiers arrayed for battle and the first soldier throwing the torch into the temple and beginning the set of the light. I mean, Holland's writing is just superb. And then at the end of the book, we do return to Jerusalem. And Scott, in the previous episode, you did have some thoughts on the Roman influence over that region that continues to today.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up again. So, even in the book, so after the Romans conquered Jerusalem, then the Roman Empire basically instilled the Palestinian government or the Palestinian peoples in that region. So you have Palestinian control of Jerusalem, where they also built religious monuments in the same places, as the Holy Land for the Jews.
But a lot later.
But it's still.
Muhammad wasn't for another 600 or 700 years.
I understand.
Okay.
But that starts
right.
That you can arguably say the Romans started the 2,000 plus year conflict that we're seeing today.
Somewhat, yeah. Before that, it was somebody else that was conquering them. Before that, it was Egypt. Before that, it was the Assyrians. That area has been conquered relentlessly for all of known human history.
The Assyrians were a Semitic people.
Yeah, but they weren't Jews.
But they were still Semitic.
Yeah, but they didn't believe the Jewish faith.
They were still Semitic. I don't think you understand what I mean. So you have an anti-Semitic.
No,
I'm just telling you, they were still Semitic peoples. The Assyrians were Semitic. I don't think the Persians were.
The Egyptians weren't.
The Egyptians were not. But I'm just telling you that's.
And go back to Moses, right?
We can go back to.
That's Moses. What I'm saying. Like, I agree with you. That was a big deal. Burning the temple, scattering the Jews to the wind, was huge in history. But the thing that I think was even more relevant is how they had synagogues all over their empire, right? And Tom talks about that a lot. And you think about it, right? And you're like, well, why was the Jewish faith spread out so much that when you wiped out Jerusalem, you didn't wipe out Judaism?
Because the people had to go somewhere.
No, and they had already spread out everywhere.
I understand.
Right? They had already spread out everywhere. Because before that, I don't know that religions were like that. Think about what I'm saying. Okay, so each city had their own god. All right, a lot of times, right? Or their own set of gods, right?
Sure.
When they moved to a new city, a lot of times I don't think they still prayed to their old gods. They just adopted the new gods. But Judaism said, we're the only true God, right? And so when they spread out, they took their religion with them. and set up synagogues and all that. And I don't know that was something that happened before that.
You're going like the the Assyrians, the Hittites, so like, it was the same thing with the Persians. Like they would take the god, the town's god. But
I got your god.
Yeah, I got your god. There you go. That's a shout out to Dan Carlin right there.
That is one of the strengths and one of the greatest, I'll say it, problems that Judaism has had, is that they did retain their monotheistic faith wherever throughout all their diaspora.
Yeah.
But that also, when they were under the control of a power that demanded that the ruler of that government be worshipped as a god, such as Rome, there was conflict, right? And it's like, look, we worship whoever you want, but also pay tithe to Caesar, because Caesar is a god too, and we literally rule your country. You know what I mean? And that created a lot of friction.
Yeah.
And I'm glad. Right. And I'm glad Holland delved into Masada just a little bit, because I love that story. But he gives it a brushing. He does, and it's towards the end. It's not the story of Masada. That's not what this book is about. But that was a major part of the Jewish revolt against Rome there. And it's just a huge part of the story of the conflict in that region with the suppression of the Judaistic religion by the Romans for the reasons that we discussed.
Yeah, it's interesting, because most other peoples that would get spread out like that and into the wind, they assimilated and didn't. So part of the reason, like Matt said, like it's a great strength, but it's also the reason they've been part of the reason they were able to be so singled out for the last 2,000 years and blamed for all the problems in the world is because they hadn't assimilated.
Yes.
Right. If they had assimilated and just been part of the cultures they were living in, instead of being Jewish, they wouldn't have been able to be so othered.
Well, but that happened.
And I'm not saying they should do that. I'm just saying that is
one of the reasons.
One of the reasons that they were able to be so othered.
Well, it's the same thing when Dan talks about, and I know we're getting off topic here, but it's the same thing Dan talks about during the Black Death or the plague, the bubonic plague. Jews were singled out. They were, horrible things happened to those people.
Because you need an other.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were there, spread out because of the Roman Empire. They went and moved to all these other cities, right? Not just because they had done that even before Jerusalem was sacked. Okay, they had spread out to all these other cities and set up synagogues in all these Roman cities because of the freedom Rome provided. Okay, and the safety it provided. So they'd spread their religion all over the Roman Empire, right? And yet, once Rome's gone, something hits the fan. Well, it's somebody's fault. Well, there's this group of people that's not us.
Yeah.
They probably do witchcraft, or they probably chanted the devil, and it's their fault, or they killed Jesus, or whatever they want to say, right? It made it a convenient thing to other.
You have to get to Jesus first before he's killed, and then Holland is just getting to the time of Jesus.
Well, no. Hadrian is
at the end of the book.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because Hadrian is what, 130 A.D. or whatever it's called now.
Well, he mentions it towards the end there,
right.
Yeah, and so
because it was still just taken off.
Right. The Christians were persecuted first, and then then you have and then once that becomes such a popular religion, then who is responsible for the death of Jesus, and you get to the Jews, and lump that in with everything else they're blamed on. I mean, there's a strong sense of community sticking together wherever they're at, allows them to become successful. I just heard a great long interview on the Cleared Hot podcast with former Navy SEAL Andy Stumpf, and he had two guys from the IDF on there.
Oh, really?
And they were just talking about. Yeah, it's his most recent episode.
Can you share a link to that later?
Yeah,
Matt?
yeah. Oh, it's very, very relevant to what's going on. I will. I'll post it. Yeah. And he talks, and at the end they talk about anti-Semitism, and one of the guys he's just like, we stick together, we're successful in business, I mean, and there's basic reasons why people at certain points in time were jealous and therefore hateful
Sure.
of Jews. It's
Yeah.
because they did well, because they were smart, and because they are bonded, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking very much as an outsider here, but there are outside influences, and you're right, you need an other. When times are going bad, who's successful, they're to blame.
Yep.
That's it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It just gives you that scapegoat. And I had never really heard that good telling of the war between the Romans and Jerusalem until this book, and it's fascinating. The prophet Benjamin something, what was his name? Matt, you remember the guy who gets struck on the head by a rock, and he wore the chains for years until his prophecy came true. What the hell is his name?
Oh, right.
Anyway, he was a leader of the Jewish rebellion. Okay, one of the leaders, and he gets conquered or captured, and he goes to Titus's father. What's Titus's father's name? And he goes to him and says, I thought the prophecy of somebody from Jerusalem ruling the world meant that it would be the Jewish people. Really, it was you. You're going to be the emperor. And so he ends up being a prisoner for years, but they take care of him because, hey, this guy predicted I'm going to be the emperor.
Yeah.
And then once he actually becomes the emperor, he takes the guy's chains off and says, look, he prophesied this. And yet he goes back to Rome and writes the whole history of the Jewish revolt against the Romans. And I can't remember his name. I'm terrible with names. But anyway, that was a fascinating thing.
No.
So.
Right. And that's one thing that struck me in the beginning of the book, too, is that there were prophecies about the downfall of Rome. And we can see sort of the inklings of their failure in the air of the culture and in the physicality of it. There's something very specific that Holland says is that after the Great Fire of Rome during Nero's time, you can blame him for that if you want. There's various going back and forth on that.
Mm-hmm.
But when he rebuilt it, there was like this national museum there, or a public building where any lowly citizen could go in and see the treasures of the empire. And there were things from all over the place. And at that point, it was kind of seen that Rome was no longer just a Roman city.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that the integration had begun.
It was the capital.
Right. And yeah, well, I'm saying that the national identity was was sort of dissolving.
Yeah, because there were so many people from all over the world living there too.
Right.
Slaves and non-slaves. I mean, all the business people coming there and all that. And it really became un-Roman-like.
Yep.
Which is something you have to watch for. That's back to Dan Carlin and the silk slippers. Right?
Right.
Right.
Silk slippers going up or wooden shoes going up and silk slippers coming down.
Right.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of that. You get a lot of that with this tale in Pax, right?
You do.
You get Nero and Caligula and see what happens when you're born into that wealth. And then you get the generals who end up taking charge and being emperor when they had to scratch and claw their whole life. And well, those guys did a lot better. And Rome did better when they were in charge.
Because they were better administrators and they understood they understood the military, first of all.
Partly.
Think of it like Eisenhower. Like Eisenhower, right? He was a great president. You know what I mean? Because he was.
I always forget about Eisenhower. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Because the other day we were talking about like how many great presidents could you name? And we should go back to Eisenhower. Yeah. He's probably the last great president. Maybe Kennedy. Maybe
Kennedy.
Maybe some people don't really like that, but I think Kennedy could have been great. He got whacked. That sucks.
I think Eisenhower balanced morality with the realities of the world.
Yeah. Well, they had just fought two world wars. It was easier to do that, I think. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's it. But it's not just that the generals were good at running the army. they weren't focused on the depravity.
Yeah, but it wasn't.
They weren't busy out there trying to bang.
Oh, I'm sure they were.
Yeah, but not like Nero. Okay, like Nero was focused on stuff that wasn't important.
Sure.
Totally.
And that's because
they saw the cost of war.
Yeah, exactly.
They saw the cost of war. Once you've like Hadrian, Holland makes a very specific point of saying this in Pax, is that Hadrian lived with his men. He not only fought with them, he traveled with them, he camped with them. When there was hard rations to eat, he ate them. When there was poor wine to drink, he drank it.
Right.
When they were sleeping in rain-soaked tents, in the storms, he was right there with them. He knew what it took to send men into battle, and that from the ground up is the strength of Rome, and it's
right.
especially during that time.
Right.
And when you have the moral attunement to the lowest, I'm not going to say the lowest level of your society, but the part that is most easily forgotten, especially nowadays when we're just waging wars overseas. You have a very real idea of what it takes to practically rule an empire, and then those people are loyal to you personally. And at a certain point, they proclaim you. You don't proclaim yourself because, hey, look, I was born to this family and I rule you now. They're like, we're the ones who just won this empire and we choose you. That is incredibly important. That was what's happening during this time of the Pax Romana.
He talks about that a lot.
Holland talks about. He does. It's a very important point of the whole book.
Emperata.
If you show me a leader that's willing to denigrate themselves to the lowliest person in the organization, I'll tell you that's a great leader. Because that's
straight up.
That's how you get great leaders.
It can be.
No, 100%. Yeah, I mean Washington. Look at George Washington.
Yeah,
he was still a soldier.
Yeah, soldier. I don't think we have any evidence that he was cleaning latrines.
You don't know?
Well, I just mean we don't have any evidence of it. That's my point. It's a good point. I shouldn't nitpick.
Great leaders.
This is the way my brain works. I'm like, yeah, but most of the time. And that's all. That's just the way my brain works. Stop. Your point is well taken. I shouldn't even nitpick it. So
you can have a crappy leader that's willing to denigrate themselves.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you garner the most loyalty from your troops, from your organization, if you are willing to live
but loyalty isn't the only thing that matters. You have to be competent. You have to be competent.
Sure. But if you know how each cog works, from the smallest cog all the way to the biggest cog, you know exactly how to use that tool.
That will help. For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, Matt, what's your biggest takeaway from PAX? What did you like most about it?
Well, I've always been fascinated with the period of time called the Pax Romana, and it's because I'm fascinated with just the age of stability, and my impression of it coming from the beginning was the prosperity within the Roman Empire at that time, and in an age of barbarity, how that was achieved. Once I began diving into, then you start reading books called Pax Romana, books called Pax, and you realize how much fighting it took to get there, what it actually took to achieve, and what that actually meant for the people on the inside and outside of that.
Right.
I think Tom Holland does an excellent job illustrating that for us. I think whether or not you're interested in specifically this area of history, it will be a good overview of Roman society at the time, and at the best, it's just a cracking good read.
Yeah. Scott?
Well, I've already brought up most of my points. I think the biggest takeaway came early in the book, especially when, and then we've already touched base on this twice now, 2 different episodes, how current events are seemingly affected by Roman time issues, especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, definitely still affected by it. It's a continuation. History is a continuation. It doesn't ever stop.
Well, but then, you look at, and don't take this the wrong way, seriously, because I know you're going to jump in and be like, you're an idiot.
Keep going.
Which side is wrong? Okay, when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Neither side, when it comes to the Holy Land, neither side is wrong. But when it comes to like a stand-up fight of, whatever, Hamas versus the Israeli Defense Forces, I have to blame Hamas for not standing up and fighting man to man.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah. See, sorry.
No. It's just a different topic, and we covered it before, and
for sure
we'll have to cover it again because this is ongoing.
Oh yeah.
But so my biggest takeaway from this is something that I think we overlook as the best thing about modern society, and that's the lack of rape and the lack of child rape, especially. The more you learn about ancient history, the more you're like, man, that happened all the time. All the time.
Yep.
Thank God it doesn't happen now as much. I mean, in our culture, in our society, we do what we can, everything we can to prevent that. And that's probably the most important thing we do.
Don't screw up the next generation.
Yeah, man. But maybe that's why the next generation is soft. It's harder to be soft when you're going through that kind of crap. And it's terrible. And I don't think that's a good reason to do that. That's not what I'm saying. But again, when I was listening to the rest of history in the Baghdad, it was a lot about that too. And then you go back to Greek culture, and there's a lot of that there too. You know, when a city's getting sacked, they talk about it all the time. It's like the young women and the cute boys. You're like, Jesus Christ,
Cremona.
man. Yeah. Like there was a lot of that. And Dan does an episode called Suffer the Children.
Yes, he does.
I only listened to that one once. It's too depressing.
It's tough.
And that's something that I think we should not take for granted. Right?
Absolutely.
Like one of the best, and maybe a lot of it is because I know. So my buddy at work would say that the biggest reason for that is the influence of Christianity on Western culture. And he might be right.
I'm not sure about that one.
Well, then what's the reason? Why is it in the West?
I think we have identified a problem that we're trying to solve. I think that's the biggest thing. I don't think it has to do with Christianity, because if it had to do with Christianity, a lot of other things that happen within like Catholicism wouldn't occur. So
yeah, but those were at least seen as this is bad.
Sure.
Where before the powerful dudes just did that, and nobody saw it as bad. It was just what they did.
Look, I'm not going to.
No, I know. This isn't religion. Okay. It's just anyway. That's just something that I thought a lot about when I was reading this book, and
that's good. So that's a third meaning to the word peace, then, that we could actually take as a positive.
That's a great point. From this. Yeah. So anyway, I think we're
gonna wrap it up.
So I'm now reading Rubicon, which is the two books before this. Tom Holland did Rubicon, which basically takes you a little bit up and really gets into Caesar and him crossing the Rubicon, overturning the Roman Republic and setting up everything to be the empire. After that one is Augustus, and I cannot wait to get to that, because that is probably the biggest lacking in my knowledge of Roman history is Augustus. Mm-hmm. I haven't read as much about him at all, and so I'm looking forward to listen to that book. But
cool.
We got to decide what the next book's going to be. So anybody that ends up listening to this, come to the Discord channel. There is a chat for this. Please suggest books. We're trying to go stuff that is hardcore history related. So either Dan mentions it in one of the podcasts, or it's related to a topic Dan has covered. I think it would probably be a good idea if we stay away from Roman history for the next one, just to spice it up.
For sure.
You know?
Well, the next book club.
The next book club. You know, it would be a fun one is if we could find a book that Dan talks about in Prophets of Doom.
Oh, wow.
Because that's one of the best episodes.
It is.
And man, is that a fascinating topic. Like, wow.
Maybe there's a biography of Martin Luther or something that would be relevant, but I can't think of anything.
Well, I'm going to go back and listen to that podcast, and maybe he mentions where he gets some of his sources. There wasn't a lot in English. I remember him saying that. Most of it was German.
Or
there are reading lists for the episodes on most of the episode channels. I haven't done them all yet, but I'm going to try and update everything. And if we find something interesting, shout it out. Anybody listening, throw it up there in the ideas and feedback channel.
Yeah. So even if you weren't in here tonight, which Jack, thanks for joining us. We appreciate that. It wasn't just us.
It's the man.
Really big heads up for joining us. But anybody who listens to this later, because this is going to be on our podcast feed, come to the link in the description to the Hardcore History Discord. Throw us some ideas in there. We'd love to hear them. And it would be, we're looking for the next book, and we hope more of you get a chance to join us. And really, we're happy to have more people on stage as well. It doesn't need to just be us. We like other people's ideas. And, Jack threw in a couple of good comments and stuff, but anybody else wants to come on and be on the podcast, video or just audio, whatever you want, we're happy to have you.
Yep.
And thanks for watching. Matt, you got anything to finish with?
Great conversation, guys.
Yeah, it was fun, buddy.
Great conversation, guys.
Yep, as usual. Thanks.
Have a good night.